Welcome, everyone, to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach political science at Ashland University, and I'm co-director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program. This year in our webinar series, we're discussing great American debates. If you happen to be joining us for the first time, the purpose is to just have an hour or so long conversation on these interesting topics by pulling together some thoughtful scholars, and for you as well to join into that conversation by submitting questions via the chat box. I'll just ask you initially, excuse me, two requests initially. Please make sure that your microphone is muted so that we don't pick up any background noise, but if you do submit a question in the chat box, and again, please do feel free to do that. Make sure that you send that to everybody, not just to me privately. That way our panelists today joining us can, if they see a question in the chat box, they can decide to run with it if they'd like. So please do submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So, as always, we try to start our conversations from original documents, and we've recommended several of those on the website, tah.org, for today's webinar. And we're discussing today MLK versus Malcolm X, and very happy to welcome two very thoughtful scholars to join us in this conversation today. Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and Lucas Morell of Washington and Lee University. So thanks to both of you for taking some of your very important time this morning to help us think through this debate.
Good to be here.
Happy to be here always.
Great. Yeah, it's always a pleasure with you two especially. So I'm going to start with a very broad question, and I'll throw out my standard statement, which is feel free to either answer it or ignore it and talk about whatever it is you'd rather talk about. But and I'm gonna kind of probably put the cart a little bit before the horse here at the beginning with this question. Let me put it this way. Malcolm X and Dr. King, I think most of us realize, had very different sort of approaches or means that they recommended to be employed in terms of achieving their ends, their goals with regard to the civil rights movement. But I'd actually like to start with the question of whether or not you think their ends or their goals are similar. Let me put the question this way, and I'll stop, and either one of you can start if you like. What is their vision, Malcolm X's vision and Martin Luther King's vision for society that they have in mind as they're calling for reforms and certain actions and things? What is it that they want to achieve? What's the kind of society that they'd like to emerge out of their calls for reforms? Do they have similar visions, very different visions? Would either of you like to start with that, or, as I said before, ignore it and talk about any other interesting thing that you'd like to talk about?
You could probably get a lot out of both of us on that question.
Well, go ahead.
So let me try to be brief. First of all, I don't know if this is very helpful to say. I mean, but partly my answer is I'm really not sure about the ultimate vision, mainly because I think Malcolm X is in a process of evolution. You know, both of them died before, I'm pretty sure, before the age of 40, and it isn't clear to me just how hostile to integration Malcolm was at the end of his life, or would have been had he lived longer. So I'll issue just kind of a blanket statement about King, and Lucas can maybe refine or refute as he sees fit. I think King's vision is total integration. I mean, is a colorblind society, not only in the sense that the law ultimately treats people just equally or neutrally, irrespective of race or color, but that social relations would be also, that all of social life would be thoroughly integrated. And what we have in Malcolm, in the speech, the ballad or the bullet immediately after the break with the Nation of Islam, you still have the statement of black nationalism, that we want to control our own, and it's likely within America. It's not a separate sovereignty, but we want to control our own neighborhoods, our own schools, our own local economies, our own local politics, and that's not fully integrationist. He declares himself, in fact, hostile to integration. But that's before he goes to Mecca and experiences what he talks about in later speeches. He talks about Islam as a colorblind religion, as a humanitarian brotherhood, and what that does to his nationalism is kind of up in the air. So that's my that's my initial foray into
Yeah.
this.
I think that's well put, Pete, and a great intro, and makes it easier for me to just work on the margins here. I want to first say, especially to our audience that are just not as familiar, I guess, with the distinctives between King and X. They know that they are, that there's this debate, formal or informal, between the two, but may not be clear on the details. I think, Chris, you posed it correctly, that to know or to understand their means, it really helps to know their ends. And when I teach my course on race and equality, I am bringing that up over and over and over again. It's not just where they want to go, but where they want to go, the kind of society they want to end up with, that presumably will lead to or represent the uplift and elevation and security of rights for Black people. Where they want to go has everything to do with how they want to get there. So for King, if the goal is what he called the beloved community, which, as Pete pointed out, is fully interracial, integrated, socially, politically, economically, you name it. I mean, no surprise coming from a preacher, the son of a preacher, a long line of preachers. It's no surprise that King sees every human being, not just every American, but every human being as made in the image of God. The Latin phrase, the imago Dei, right? That every human bears the image of God, and therefore race, sex, these are, in the grand scheme of things, ephemeral things, things that should not get into the way of people loving one another, not just tolerating, but loving one another. For King, because the end is a loving community, the means have to be loving. And so you can point out, as it were, famous right line, or at least principle of Christianity, hate the sin, but love the sinner. And so for King, the means had to be nonviolent because that's where the goal was. You can't use violence to get to nonviolence. You can't use hate to get to love. And so for King, it's pretty easy to line up the means with the end. With Malcolm X, as Pete pointed out, another thing to keep clear is always ask the question, which Malcolm? Is it the Malcolm X who was the grand spokesman of the Nation of Islam, which was led at the time by a guy named Elijah Muhammad? Or is it the Malcolm who's in this process of evolution, development, not sure? And he was asked this question point blank in 64, early 65. So what is your vision now? And he said, all I know is what I want for Black people. How we get there doesn't really matter. He had not developed a coherent social or political philosophy or even program to get there. He became much more pragmatic about the how. And that meant he was much more open to accepting the support of whites, whereas before they were just flat out devils. I mean, literal devils. And that was the Nation of Islam theology, that whites were irredeemably devilish. They were due for punishment. They basically were walking around the earth with targets on their back, and God was going to smite them imminently. And so if you were a Black person, you would be stupid to intermarry with whites. You would be stupid to be in business with them, to go to school with them. You want to stay away from them as far as possible. The line he liked to use was, you don't integrate with a sinking ship. And so even though it looks like whites are in control right now, and they are, don't worry, it's only a matter of time before God blows them off the face of the earth. I'm speaking crudely here. And then blacks will resume their place of dignity and position and stature in society. That's Nation of Islam, Malcolm. So for him, it was clear that where are we headed? A black nation. You can't be a people without a nation, without a culture, without a religion, without a language. And for black people in the United States, all of those things are not true in the highest sense. They like to use the phrase that you're nothing but an ex-slave. I mean, Elijah Muhammad would say this to prospective converts. Malcolm X would say this to them to jar them into thinking, well, what do you mean I'm an ex-slave? I don't have manacles on me. And then he would run down the list of all the ways in which they have bought into white American society in terms of the religion, the language, the culture, and notice how in all those scenarios they are receiving the short end of the stick. And they're receiving the short end because those things are not really for them. Those things are really for the white majority. They should have a different language, Arabic. They should have a different religion. It's a baldlerized version of Islam, but some, different sort of, and no Orthodox Sunni or Shiite Muslim thinks that the Nation of Islam is even a denomination in real Islam. So anyway, I'm talking longer than I should be, but the point is, while Malcolm X was the spokesman for the Nation of Islam theology taught this cultural, religious, social black nationalism, which required a nation. And so they needed a plot of earth where they themselves could rule themselves, govern themselves, teach themselves, engage in the market themselves, away from this majority white society, at least on American soil, that was destined for doom. Post Nation of Islam, Malcolm was much more open to the means question. I think some of us have seen that poster with Malcolm holding an AK-47 by a window, menacingly looking out of this building, second floor, third floor, and then the catchphrase at the bottom says, "by any means necessary." Now, that's the most extreme, literal portrait of that, but the principle, I think, was true for Malcolm. For him, it was the end that was important, that they be afforded, and here's where he starts sounding like an American, where their human rights and their civil rights are secured and protected. How to secure it, how to protect it, that he was open. He was all ears, relatively speaking, practically speaking, in terms of the how.
No, that's great. Thank you, Lucas. I have a ton of follow-up questions, and we've got a great question from Dustin in the chat feature too. So I'll just go to Dustin's question if you don't mind. And I think we've touched on this a little bit already with regard to Malcolm X, but Dustin asks, how would each individual define black power?
Yeah, I saw that question. I like that question, and there's a lot to say about that question. But again, we'll try to observe a little bit of restraint anyway. So let's take King first. I think there's, let me say generally, let me back up a step and say generally, in an overview, I think there's, in a way, a sharp difference between King and Malcolm on this question. But it isn't maybe quite the difference that comes to first sight. And there are actually interesting similarities between King and Malcolm on the question of black power. Now to start with King, I think the story is reasonably well known that for King, the emergence of black power as an actual slogan and as an actual fracturing of the freedom movement in the mid-1960s, 1966 to be precise, was a big problem. And he resisted Stokely Carmichael's call to kind of change the face and change the rhetoric of the movement and call for, change the emphasis and call for black power, because he saw in it a rejection of the nonviolence ethic, that the last of our King selections is King wrestling with this challenge to nonviolence that comes after the enactment of, well, mainly after the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. So Stokely Carmichael is fed up with all of the violence that's being perpetrated against the participants in the freedom cause, and so he in Mississippi he kind of commandeers the microphone, so to speak, and starts leading a crowd in the chant of Black Power, and this is over the objections of King, and so King. You can find King saying very hostile things about Black Power. You can find King saying that this is rooted in a sentiment of bitterness, that it is a message that's really purveying hatred, that it's in an obvious way anti-integrationist, and it's a dead end. It's a kind of suicide for the movement. You can find him saying these kinds of hostile things, but King is enough of a politician and enough of a compromiser that he sees that he's losing his authority within the civil rights movement. That in a certain sense, what he did to the NAACP in the late 1950s, that is, he radicalizes the movement, he takes it out of the law courts, he introduces the idea of street protest, direct action protest, civil disobedience, all of which the NAACP was very uncomfortable with. Mm-hmm. And he managed to portray them as sort of old-fashioned and too conservative. He was the young firebrand in the late 50s, maybe, and that same thing exactly almost is being done to him by Stokely Carmichael and the younger activists in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who want the movement to be much more radical. So King sees this fracturing, and he sees his authority waning, and he thinks, and he's sticking to the conviction all along that the movement absolutely has to preserve its nonviolence ethic. If it's gonna be effective in American society and political life, so the movement has to be repaired. It can't be allowed to be, so to speak, a house divided, and so that means that he's got to take some steps to make himself to preserve his relevance. And so you can find him also saying rather friendly things to the idea of Black Power. That Black Power, properly understood, appears in our economic strength. So we can use the means of boycotts, for instance. We can use, even to some extent, there's a kind of strength in numbers. We can use a more mass and militant form of civil disobedience, a more disruptive kind of civil disobedience, to exert an actual power as pressure on certain institutions to change. So to the extent that he's emphasizing economic power and more militant sorts of measures short of violence, then there's a fair amount of overlap with what Malcolm X says. Here's to bring in him. Here's what I would say about the difference. You can see actually throughout these writings, as well as others, that in their way, both King and Malcolm are really fundamentally preoccupied with the moral psychology of Black Americans. Both of them are very concerned to develop a stronger sentiment of self-respect than they think it has been historically present. King thinks that Black Americans, many of them at least, have been really demoralized, dispirited by life under Jim Crow and segregation. And I think to some extent Malcolm agrees with that, although Malcolm sees King as a symptom of the demoralization rather than as a remedy. But they're both concerned with a way of cultivating self-respect among Blacks. The thing is, to address your question a little more directly, for King, nonviolence is power. Nonviolence exerts a kind of moral power. It is associated with direct action, standing up for your rights. It's an assertion of self-respect, and it's also the display of a kind of moral discipline that dignifies you, and so King uses this phrase repeatedly: unearned suffering is redemptive, to demonstrate the moral discipline and the moral strength, and in a good way, the spirit of self-sacrifice to win one's rights. That for King is moral power. You could summarize it, I think, by saying that for King, moral power means changing the psychology not only of blacks but also of white Americans. And you elicit the sympathy of white Americans by, in effect, appealing to a kind of love, by this ethic of Christian charity and Christian sacrifice. Malcolm also thinks that his protest methods are going to exert a kind of moral power. But rather than, I think, the capacity to elicit love, it's first and foremost the capacity to elicit fear. Down the road may be love, maybe even for Malcolm, but first and foremost fear. You demonstrate to people, first of all, that you're dangerous to them, that you have the power to affect vital interests of theirs, and at least that makes them respect you. And with that respect over time, out of that respect over time can grow something broader. So there's a kind of fear and love dialectic between King and Malcolm, but I don't think it's accurate to say that one of them is appealing to a kind of moral power and the other one to a non-moral power. They're both appealing to a kind of moral power, but just in different ways. All right.
But the moral power from King comes from the love, and the moral power for X comes from.
Yeah, when I say moral power, I think you could ascribe to both of them this proposition, that what we're trying to do is to engender in the larger community a spirit of moral sympathy. That moral sympathy meaning white Americans need to see black Americans as full human beings. They need to see their full humanity in ways they haven't historically. How do you go about doing that? And that's what I'm saying. For King, make yourself lovable, make yourself sympathetic. For Malcolm, make yourself fearsome.
Well, there's so many great points in there. By the way, excuse me. I mentioned Lucas earlier. I'm teaching an undergrad class on race and politics in modern America, and we're just about to start King and X next week. So this is going to be really useful to me personally. But just so many great points in there. Just one thing I jotted down, of course, was you mentioned that King actually radicalized the NAACP by calling for active protests. And yeah, it was nonviolent and all that, but that's often overlooked because Malcolm X often his extremism often makes King look moderate, but that's not necessarily true. So I noted that. And I've heard you speak on this, Pete. As you know, you were here last year, I think, right? Or 2 years ago to talk about it.
I deny everything.
You deny everything, but I've heard you speak on King. And you talked about King having to recognize the sort of political necessities of maintaining leadership so he can keep the movement headed in a certain direction, which is also a very interesting aspect of King. He seems to be aware of the politics of things, right, within the movement itself. But that does that add to the complexity of trying to figure out who the real King is as well? Because you have I always get the sense that you have the ideals of King, but then you also see, especially the later King, having to bend in certain ways to some of the more radical aspects of things. It seems like that adds to the difficulty of knowing who the real King is.
I think so. Yeah, I'll be briefer about that. I'm sure Lucas has opinions about that. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a way of, to some extent, tracing through at the level of intentions, a coherent intention in King. But there is that question, because King's rhetoric does become considerably very significantly more radical, let's say, in what he calls phase two of the movement post 1965. And the question is, how far is this just King thinking that the movement is on its own motion, kind of now coming to a radical phase that was implicit all along, or is it King being pulled in the direction of radicalism by more radical elements in the movement who want to change its direction? That's not an easy question to sort out. King makes references here and there, as very many black leaders have throughout the course of history, that there's a tendency to say different things to different audiences, and so there's a certain degree of esotericism in the rhetoric of a lot of black leaders, and that again adds to the difficulty.
Yeah, no, that's great, and also the language. Not only you see increasing instances of language of black power, as you were saying, on King's part, but also the sort of turn to socialism, which maybe we can talk about at some point as well, on Dr. King's part as well. But Lucas, I didn't mean to talk so much here. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on any of this. I have some questions for you as well. But
yeah, on the question of the black psyche, which is really, I mean, psyche is Greek for the word soul. So King, I think Peter's right to identify black self-respect and an elevation in their, elevation of a self-elevation, that they deserve more and should stand up for more, but the means of doing so were very different for Malcolm X and the Black Power movement that followed on the one hand, and King on the other. As Pete pointed out, King said, you know what moral courage is going to look like? It's going to be receiving hatred, vile language, and physical blows and not responding in kind. And that's an actual real force, a force that is seconded, if you will, by the universe. In King's mind, that was God. This is how agape love works. Whereas for Malcolm X and the Black Power, his godchildren, as it were, the Black Power movement of Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton and others, they said, no, whites will respect you when you respect yourself. And no self-respecting person allows himself to be mistreated in these ways. We don't preach violence, we preach self-defense. This isn't radical, this isn't extreme, it's intelligence. Even an animal knows that it shouldn't be abused and will defend itself. For black people not to do even what a mere animal, the brute creation, does in defense of itself, that doesn't deserve any pity or respect, and certainly won't get any from the majority white society. So both King and X, yes, began with saying we have to affirm our own manhood. They were both very much masculine in their approach to their thinking of these things in a broad sense, although more generally, of course, King saw the equal dignity of women. But he had an old-fashioned sense as well, and you see that with his communications with Coretta in particular. If you look at their letters, so yeah, how you get to full humanity and how you get, especially the white majority of America, to see the full humanity of blacks, I do think that they both began with self-affirmation, but the means going forth from that were very different. A little more on Black Power. King, as he would say in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which was his final statement about what he believes with regards to what should happen with the movement, King said, denotatively, Black Power, there's nothing wrong with that, but rhetorically it's a bad move because it implies black dominance or domination, or it's merely a reaction to white supremacy with black supremacy, and King did not buy that. So he just thought, understood correctly, there is absolutely nothing wrong with blacks controlling their economies, their politics, etc., but it won't be read, and it's already being misconstrued or misinterpreted by the grander society, and we can't ignore that. Public opinion is extremely important in a self-governing nation. King knew that better than anyone, and how we shape that opinion is important. We can't be reckless with the terms that we are using. Toure, Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton said, no, we are tired of having our politics and our lives and what we deserve dictated by people who don't look like us. And so we've got to come up with our own terms, our own definitions, our own values. We don't want to integrate into middle white America and what they consider their dream. We've got to determine our own values and our own dreams, and not simply assimilate. That is it harks back to W.B. Du Bois's understanding of why the races should be conserved. That there is something that blacks can contribute to the world if they develop their own idea of what is good, noble, beautiful, etc. And this will redound to the benefit of everyone. And so the Black Power guys kind of get that from Du Bois, this idea that blacks shouldn't simply mimic what whites have been telling themselves. And so they need to come up with a way to act as a unit, as a block. We may not be the majority of American society, but we could be the majority in certain cities, in certain regions, and we should act like a block and think like a block. And ditto for the economy, that we need to do more in terms of creating our own businesses, etc. And in those essentials, I think also politically and economically, there is actually a lot in common that King shared with the Black Power movement in terms of blacks controlling their own destinies. So I would say the self-help, if I can pronounce this correctly, gospel, there is actually greater affinity there than people are willing to grant them, at least at face value.
I just wanted to, just a quick word to kind of underline what Lucas was saying about the rhetoric. I think that King's fundamental objection to the whole thing was, to the whole Black Power thing, was that what you are doing is placing the concept of power rather than the concept of justice at the center of moral discussion. And that's a gigantic mistake. That's a gigantic political mistake, and it's a gigantic moral and philosophical mistake also. And it wasn't just that Carmichael and Hamilton were being misinterpreted. They, in a kind of a famous passage early in their book Black Power, they quite explicitly say that. You know, what they say is that we're gonna be in control of how to define words. You know, really for the first time in America, and we can make these words mean what we want them to mean, and that's really all for them. At least the way they present it, that's really all that politics is. They quote Hans Morgenthau, who's famous among political scientists anyway, as a teacher of realism, which is a kind of Machiavellian doctrine, that the relations among states are really about power and interest. They're not about justice. And Carmichael and Hamilton think that it's realistic to interpret American politics domestically this way, that it is a kind of struggle for power among groups who define themselves ethnically. And that blacks need just to realize that and take their place and get their share in this struggle for power, and stop moralizing about justice to people who aren't interested in talking about justice. So that's what all of that really troubled King.
Yeah, if we can just make a comment on a comment on a comment. This is actually a nice segue back to Malcolm X. I mean, this is why Malcolm X wanted to move the discussion from civil rights to human rights. Now, you would think moving it from civil rights to human rights, you could stay in America, because America was founded on human rights, right? All men are created equal. What did they have before the creation of government? Rights, equally endowed, life, liberty, freedom, happiness. That's why you have to ask their permission before you tell them what to do. Government by consent of the government. But for Malcolm and for the Black Power guys, but especially for Malcolm, that's why you had to move the venue or the arena of a discussion of, if you will, justice to an arena where you are the majority. In the United States, nationally, blacks aren't the majority, so they are going to receive whatever the whites want to give them or not. All right, what whites will give and what they will deprive them of. Move it to the Hague, move it to the World Court, move it to the United Nations, and then we can start talking not about black rights, but human rights as it's determined not just by blacks, but use the term today, people of color. So where Africans, generally speaking, or those of African descent, so not just black Americans, but the continent of Africa as well as South America, the brown people, if you will, and then what Malcolm X would call the yellow people, right? The Asians. If you get all of them together, all of a sudden the former colonial hegemonic powers, they're no longer in the majority. And if the people of color can unite, they can exert, as Pete well pointed out, power. Forget justice. That's sentimental. That's naive. Nobody really makes decisions on the basis of sentimentality or appeals to conscience. Now they have to listen to us. Now they will see us at minimum as equals, if not their superiors in terms of numbers. Now we can have an honest discussion about what we are owed, what we are due. And that's why Malcolm X, especially after the Nation of Islam, says, let's start making this an international question, not simply a domestic one.
Chris, can I, with an apology, can I add a comment on a comment on a comment? I'll try to go quickly.
No, please do. No.
Couple of points. One, it's kind of interesting that Malcolm here is in this sense not as radical as the Black Power authors are, because in the sense that Malcolm is continuing to talk about justice. He's talking about rights, and he's talking about, yes, he's talking about the power we need to acquire to achieve justice. But he's making the baseline a consideration of justice, which is something that Black Power guys go beyond. That's one point. Another point is that King has this language also of appealing to a world forum,
yes.
And appealing to human rights. They say actually the two, King and Malcolm, say quite similar things in this respect. That's kind of interesting, and in it I see this distinction, although I'm not sure this is a disagreement between the two. In Malcolm, the emphasis is just as Lucas said. It is it's structural and jurisdictional, that we're not getting a fair hearing, so to speak, in the local politics of the U.S., but we can get a fairer hearing in the broader politics of the UN, because people like us are more, or so he presumes that people are like them, are more in control of the UN. So that's one thing. When King appeals to the difference between civil rights and human rights, he's talking about different kinds of rights also. That's partly a transition from speaking about the classical liberal rights that were achieved in the first phase of the civil rights movement. I mean, culminating in the right to vote, but civil rights regarding the right to property and equal treatment under law and fair access to the protections of the criminal justice system and so forth. Those are all classical liberal rights. But in phase two, he's talking about socioeconomic rights. He's talking about the kinds of rights that are spelled out in the second half of the UN Declaration on Rights, which are not contemplated in the American Declaration of Independence, rightly understood, because they're really not classical liberal rights. They're rights to income and health care and things like that, and employment that King was concerned with in phase two. Okay, done.
No, this is great. You guys should keep going, because you're actually, it's like you're one step ahead of me. You're anticipating every question I wanted to ask anyway. Perfect.
Why do we have a moderator?
We don't need a moderator. But I did want to, you raised the Declaration of Independence, and Lucas, you started talking about this, both King and Malcolm X tried to elevate the conversation to the level of human rights in a certain way. But I'm also, and again, I don't know much about the post Nation of Islam Malcolm X. I know more about the angry X. But King does make an appeal to the ideals or the principles of the American founding and the Declaration of Independence. in several important instances, especially as I have a dream speech. And you were just saying that, of course, those broad principles, sort of broad demands of justice in that sense, have to be satisfied, but those are not enough for King, and it has to go further into other more particular types of rights. But Malcolm X seemed to reject the American founding. I can't think of a particular place where he does this, but my sense is that he would be the sort of person who would have said, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, to hell with them. I mean, he never invokes them. And in fact, I'm sorry, I can't find a particular place where he does this, but my sense is that somewhere he flat out rejects those. Why would he do that and instead make this turn to these other sorts of rights? Does it have something to do with the argument that the founding was corrupt and those principles themselves did nothing but justify the establishment of a white power society, white wealthy power structure?
Well, I guess I wouldn't put too fine a point on him rejecting the founding principles, because what I find, and I have always found this remarkable about Malcolm X, is how unself-aware he is of how American he sounds when he talks about.
You said that earlier, yeah, Lucas. That's what made me think of this. You said that earlier. He sounds American at times, but
yeah. Well, I mean, first off, to speak the language of rights is to speak the language of the Declaration of Independence. Now, if it could be the case that what one person means by rights doesn't have anything to do with what Jefferson meant, or Washington, or Hamilton, or you name it. But I think with X, he even as he complains, I mean, his very complaints are complaints that you would see the validity of by virtue of reference to those very rights. I mean, he complains about the 13th Amendment not because it doesn't sound like a good thing. He just thinks we haven't lived up to it. And so to speak of human rights, you don't learn that from the Declaration of Rights from the UN. You could have learned that way back in 1776. So he quotes Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Like King, I mean, King said it famously, all we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper. And what paper? The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. I don't think Malcolm X would disagree with that. I think Malcolm X, he says, when he's asked by Louis Lomax, well, look, you keep calling for a nation. Don't Black Americans have a nation? Isn't America their nation? And X goes, how could it be their nation? They're not citizens of America. They're victims of America. But when he says that they are victims precisely because they have not received the full protection. They have not been afforded the full range of capitalizing on their opportunities and getting an education, getting a job, getting promoted. For him, it's the gap between profession and practice. So I really wouldn't. I'd like to hear what Pete would say about this. I really wouldn't categorize Malcolm X as someone who has rejected America in principle. Everything he points to is our failure in practice to live up to the principles. And as he says, if you want us to stop talking about revolution, how about your government start doing its job? That was the catchphrase of his. If the American government would, in his words, do its job, then Malcolm would shut up. In other words, the presumption is it's not the structure that's wrong. It's the white people who are exercising that authority, exercising that power, and only doing it for people that look like them and not doing it for people of color. So, Pete, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would add this further thought that I imagine you would have added too, if you were willing to take more time talking about it. I don't think Malcolm is actually hostile to the principles of the U.S., of the American founding, as he understood them, and the way he understands them in the way that Lucas was describing is more or less consonant with the way that we understand them. That that the country is founded as a regime that's supposed to secure rights for everybody and provide protection for the law in a non-biased way. But beyond that, Malcolm actually, well, let me interject this, that I think Malcolm, it's a little harder to figure out after the break from the nation than it is before. But he makes very clear in 1963, before the break from the Nation of Islam, what he thinks about the American Revolution and the Declaration. And he's very friendly to them, but he considers them an example of a nationalist revolution. Not a revolution really based on natural human rights, at least not in any simple way. He says the American Revolution is white nationalism. I mean, which means to say that Malcolm X takes the view of the Declaration and the American Revolution that's in principle identical with the view that Stephen Douglas takes in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He says the country is founded on the white basis, and it's meant to secure rights for all the whites, and we need to imitate that. So that's not really a rejection of the principles. It's just that we need to have our own country and ground them on similar principles, but interpreted in that more partial nationalistic kind of way. If I could add just a quick further thought about King, this maybe will stir the pot a little more. This is kind of an extension. This is addressing your present question, Chris, and it's also an extension of an answer to one of your earlier questions. King is hard to figure out, even though King seems rhetorically much friendlier to the founders. There's rhetoric in the Dream speech, but there's rhetoric in a lot of King's speeches, invoking the founders, magnificent words of the Declaration and the Constitution, deep wells of democracy dug by the founders. So really, the founders created this great promise of an American dream, equality for all, and all we need to do is realize that promise. So we don't need to be at all hostile to the founders. And my sense about that is that he means that fully, and he's perfectly sincere about that. But I'm not completely sure about it. And the reason I'm not completely
have a reason for not being sure, Pete.
The reason I'm not completely sure is this. King is a social democrat progressive from beginning to end. He really never was a classical liberal. And so what does this mean regarding his approach to the Declaration of Independence, which really is a classical liberal doctrine of natural rights? I think there are two choices. The one choice is that King thinks the progressive social democratic interpretation is the correct interpretation of the full implications of the idea that people have natural human rights. So I think he would say between, so to speak, the first half and the second half of the UN Declaration of Rights, there isn't a conflict. The second just is the completion of the first. That's one possibility, and I think that's the more likely possibility. So that's why I say I think he's friendly to the founders, fully when he says things friendly to them. But the other possibility is that, again, as you and Lucas well know, that some of the progressives are playing a kind of a Machiavellian game, meaning in what they say about the founding. That is, Machiavelli says that a wise prince who wants to initiate a new order is going to be more likely to succeed if he makes the new order look old, if he diminishes the radical appearance of it. And Woodrow Wilson does this, and I think FDR does this in their commentary about the Declaration of Independence. It isn't impossible that King is doing the same thing. He sort of hints at that in the last of the selections we have, when he says about the rights that he's concerned with now, the socioeconomic rights. He says, I admit these are not constitutional rights. These are rights that we have to go beyond the Constitution to see. So, how much of that is King using the Declaration for his own purposes as opposed to sincerely affirming it? That's what I'm not quite sure about.
Yeah, I would, if I can add a little, just a little bit here. To the extent that King is disappointed by how slow progress is coming after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, those short years, of course, because of his murder. To the extent that he's disappointed that that black progress, if you will, white progress in doing the right thing according to those laws. To that extent, he thinks something has to be done more in the United States. And the most radical king, you think about the word radica, which means root, the most radical king is the king that calls for a restructuring of American society, which means if you say restructuring, are you saying more than just that people have to change their minds and live according to these old principles, but universal principles, the principles of the Declaration? Or are you saying, you know, do we need a different kind of constitution? Do we need something more than the Civil Rights Act? So in a speech that he gave in '67, he says, you know, he quotes this famous passage from John chapter 3 about having to be born again. And this is the line that this is the policy that he draws from that. He said, in other words, quote, your whole structure must be changed. I'm like, your whole structure? I have in my margins, huh? What exactly does King mean by that?
Sounds like Malcolm X, the Malcolm X I would have.
Yeah, I mean, to say that a structure has to be changed and the whole one, that's the social democratic progressive that he is talking about. That's the king who was always there. As he was courting Coretta King, he is criticizing capitalism. He has never been a big fan of capitalism, and I'm guessing, I would surmise here, I haven't done a study of this, but my surmise here is he doesn't understand capitalism well enough. But what he does understand of it, he doesn't like the fact that there are still poor people in a free country, in a country where rights, for the most part, are protected. He doesn't like a country that somehow hasn't solved the problem of poverty. He blames that society, not just its people, but it's what he calls its structures. So my question is, well, what exactly would he want to be done differently in terms of capital and its formation and generation? He sounds an awful lot like people today. I'll keep this nonpartisan, but he sounds an awful lot like people today who take for granted the wealth that is generated and presume that because some people have a lot more than others, that therefore those people who have a lot more don't deserve that lot more. And I'm not saying every single one of them does. There's a laudable critique of what goes by the name of crony capitalism. I understand that. But King's sense of it is, good grief, a country as wealthy as America should not have poor people. And if they have poor people, it is in no way, shape, form, or fashion the fault of those poor people. That had to be the fault of somebody, or more principally, that has to be the fault of the very structure that allowed it to happen. And so for America to be all that God wants it to be, it has to be born again in this sense. It needs to take a closer look at the generation of wealth and the distribution, which is to say the redistribution of that wealth once it is generated, to make sure that everybody truly has the opportunities that God wants them to make good on. It's not enough to protect them in their natural human rights. We have got to make sure that they are able to compete at a level that allows, interestingly enough, even though it's a competition, it makes sure that even the losers aren't left out of the games.
Wow, that's fascinating. So many great points in there, and I had a couple of follow-ups. But Pete, do you want to follow up on that first?
I kind of do. Yeah, I second all of that. For as much as we have to say to each other, it's kind of remarkable that Lucas and I really pretty much never disagree on anything, but we always find ways to add to each other's points. There's a statement. King was wary about talking about socialism. He knew that it was very unpopular in the U.S. But he gets frustrated with, he regarded the pace of change as inadequate in 1966, and he thought that the inadequacy of the pace of change was very dangerous. I mean, let's keep in mind that this is a social climate in which there are riots. I mean, urban riots erupting in very many cities, from 65 to 68, the number's over 300, I believe, in mid-sized and larger American cities. And so King can't look at this from a point of view of hindsight. I mean, he thinks the country is possibly going up in flames here, and he thinks that the root cause of this is the country's inability, or at least to this point, the country's failure to respond to the legitimate demands of disadvantaged people as quickly as it should have. So really quickly, following upon the enactment of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, from King's point of view, should have been a war on poverty that was tenfold the magnitude of the one that LBJ actually enacted. That's what he was calling for. And so he gives this, it's kind of a private statement at the time in a speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at its annual convention. He says, okay, now we really maybe have to start talking more forthrightly about socialism. And there's a body of scholarship, some of it's more kind of activist commentary about King in recent years that's reaching kind of a consensus that when conservatives talk about King and they revere King as the apostle of colorblindness and so forth, they're ignoring the radical dimension of King. And there's a portion of truth in that criticism, that the radical dimension of King is the social democratic dimension of King. And so there's a volume, actually, people can look it up if they want, a small anthology of King's writings in this more radical direction that's called The Radical King, that's edited by Cornel West, who very prominent academic who considers himself kind of one of King's apostles, so to speak, a continuer of the King legacy. And Cornel West was very unhappy with Barack Obama for being, in his view, insufficiently radical, sort of neoliberal. And so Cornel West was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. So I think Cornel West thinks that the Bernie Sanders agenda really is the MLK agenda translated into the 21st century.
Yeah.
And interestingly, and by the way, one last thought about that. That marks another kind of point of convergence between King and Malcolm. Malcolm has this peculiar tension, calling for self-help, calling for urban enterprise. And so you can see why some black conservatives came out of that dimension of Malcolm. But you can also find Malcolm saying in his later years, you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. And bringing the likes of Che Guevara, as a speaker to one of his Organization of Afro-American Unity meetings and so forth. So Malcolm is trying to propagate this revolutionary socialist agenda also in these years.
It's fascinating. Do we just hopefully a quick question? Do we know what, because we talked about Dr. King not being satisfied with the pace of change after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Of course, X died before the Voting Rights Act. Do we know what he thought about the Voting Rights Act? I'm sorry, the Civil Rights Act? Probably not enough as well.
Well, that's my sense is that he would have distrusted its enforcement. I mean, what the more prominent things he says about it, I think, are implicit in the Ballot or the Bullet speech, right, which is spring 1964, at pretty much the exact moment in which the Civil Rights Act is bottled up in a Senate filibuster. And so he distrusts the political system to be able to produce a civil rights bill. My inference from that would be that he would also distrust its ability to actually enforce it, even after its enactment.
Yeah. There's a little bit of an unfair question. I didn't know if we actually had anything on record from Malcolm X on the Civil Rights Act, but we've got a number of other great. I'm going to be unselfish here. I have many questions I want to ask, but I'm going to defer to some of the great questions that are coming in the chat box. So the most recent is from Angela, and I want to circle back to some of the earlier ones too that I think might help us sort of wrap things up in a few minutes. But Angela asked, don't you think Dr. King knew the audience he was trying to reach, meaning the people in power, and the use of nonviolence was the only way to reach those people with the use of TV and so on and so forth? I'm not sure if you can see the question.
Lucas, you want to? I know you've got you got opinions on that. You want to take a crack at that?
I mean, just the easiest answer is letter from Birmingham jail is Exhibit A for King's use of the media to try to draw attention to the struggle, the modern civil rights movement. That he knew. I mean, in fact, it was tough because what he was doing in Birmingham, the New York Times was against, and like all the major social, cultural, intellectual, not intellectual, but all the major cultural influences that had been on their side were against him there. They thought it was untimely. They thought it was imprudent. Let the election play out, etc. The administration, Kennedy administration, was not on his side, and so he was unpopular in his attempt to shape popular opinion in that particular major event. But yeah, there is no modern civil rights movement without the press. There is no modern civil rights movement without television. I Have a Dream speech was televised. So they knew, especially given that their front target was Southern injustices against Black people, that they had to bring in the nation and marshal the resources of the nation to address it. It wasn't enough to get the press sort of on their side in Southern governments that were lily white, one-party Democratic capital D states that were not interested in moving any quicker on civil rights. And so they needed federal courts on their side. They needed federal legislatures on their side because state legislatures were against them and state judges were against them. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, the civil rights, why I Have a Dream speech in '63, because that summer is when the Civil Rights Act is being, or Civil Rights Bill is being debated in Congress. The one photograph I believe we have of King and X in the same frame is of them both smiling in a hallway during the filibustering and the debates and committee hearings with regards to that bill. The March on Washington was supposed to be staged at the Capitol because that's where laws are made. And then at some point they decided let's hold this in front of the Lincoln Memorial. So yeah, television is very much an essential part of this. And a great documentary that all but demonstrates this is the Eyes on the Prize documentary, which so much of that footage was national footage, was press footage with regards to what was happening. So when these horrible things were happening to individual Black Americans, the rest of America thought, my goodness, that's in my country? And so King takes advantage of that and talks about that. In fact, opens the letter from Birmingham jail about that. You know, that famous line, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Yes. I mean, that's his national appeal to get Americans elsewhere to care about what was happening to fellow Americans in this particular neck of the woods, in the hopes that public opinion, public pressure will be brought to bear in those instances. So the short answer is, was he aware of the audience? Yes.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this was implied in Angela's question, where she talks about King knowing that the use of nonviolence was the only way to reach those people. But I think he believed that, but I don't think that means he didn't believe it was also the right way to go about it.
I would say it's both, and like any deft rhetorician, if he's got both on his side, he should do it. The "I Have a Dream" speech, moving away from the letter from Birmingham jail essay, turning to the speech. The speech, King is very explicit about contrasting his and his movement's nonviolent methods, peaceful methods, and contrasting that with what is he called? He makes a reference to a marvelous new militancy.
Right.
Okay. But both in that speech and explicitly in the letter from Birmingham jail, he basically uses Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam as he's playing good cop, bad cop there. He's like, look, you have us to deal with, and we're not even hitting back. White people should be falling over themselves, wanting to learn from us what justice will require, because if you don't like us, my goodness, there is an alternative among blacks in the United States, and then it appeared to be an alternative that was growing precisely because black youth were becoming more open to the militancy of a Malcolm X as opposed to the moral courage and the power of agape love of a Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, very well put. So we have about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I kind of wanted to hold off on a question from Candy and from Dan, a question Dan submitted earlier, because it might lead to a nice way to wrap things up. So maybe for a couple of minutes, this is going to be really unfair. You guys are going to really not like me for this, but
so Pete, take this one.
I think, well, no, I think you two are agreeing too much, as Pete pointed out earlier. So
I didn't say too much. I like agreeing with you.
Oh, okay, all right.
I think I'm in good company.
So let me just say something here about when we started. Pete, you mentioned that it's, of course, Malcolm X's thought is in evolution and in the time, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you said he ended up being hostile to integration throughout pretty much his career. Lucas, you seem to suggest that the later Malcolm X seemed open to integration, so long as we keep in mind the distinction between assimilation and integration, which I think is a very important distinction. Yeah. So I'm wondering, first of all, which of the two is the true X? But could you also talk a little bit about the difference between integration and assimilation in the minds of both X and Malcolm X and Dr. King? Because I think that's a really important distinction. I've had this conversation in my undergraduate class this semester. That distinction between integration and assimilation, and it reminded me when you brought this up. I think Lucas earlier, the one who made that distinction. It reminded me of the Ralph Ellison essay around 70, which I had the students read on what America would be like without blacks.
Exactly.
So just so let me simplify the question a little bit. What did Malcolm X and Dr. King think the relationship should be in society between whites and blacks? Maybe that didn't simplify it. Maybe that.
No. Both Pete and I are being polite, waiting for the other one to go first.
Right.
We're interrupting a second what the other person said. What you got something come immediately to mind, Pete?
Well, since we're so short on time, let me really try to keep this to just a couple of sentences, because there might be other questions Chris wants to get to, at least quickly. I would say for King, ultimately there should be no difference. Integration should be assimilation. I think for King, King wanted a society that treats differences of color as just utterly shallow, as only that, as differences of color, not deep differences of culture and nationhood and so forth. Malcolm, I'm not sure, because again, in the Ballot or the Bullet speech, there's clearly a desire for a nationalist solution. The question is whether that's whether that's instrumental or whether that's an ultimate destination solution. That is, are the race differences permanent? And so we need to just treat everybody as a member of a racial group and treat the groups equally, or do we want to have a situation in which this is a means for building black self-respect and respect from the surrounding community, but after that's done, then fuller integration can take place. The remarks about Islam and brotherhood suggest that he might have been going in a more fully, well, I think full integration means assimilation, but integration can be understood in more partial ways. Does that make any sense?
I'll quickly add that the starting point for Malcolm is he clearly stopped saying and believing, and I'm not even sure if he ever believed that white people were literal devils, right, the way it was preached by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. But he made clear to people, look, I no longer believe that. As Pete pointed out, he met Muslims who were the very people he defined as devils, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He met blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims who welcomed him with open arms as a fellow human being and believer, and they did not hold the color of his skin against him. And at that point, at least publicly, once he broke from the nation, publicly he said, I can't say this about white people generally anymore, because I have met them who are believers in what he believed at that point, right? I believe he became a Sunni Muslim, an Orthodox Muslim by that point. That was just simply not true for him. That's not what his new religion, no longer the Baldwinized version of Islam, preached. I mean, it wasn't a color. It wasn't religion based on color. So, he no longer believes white men are devils. The integration thing, he spoke more about human brotherhood near the end of his life, which at least in principle implies that race is, as Pete put it, only skin deep. It's an ephemeral thing. It's an incidental or accidental thing. It's not the thing that he used to preach, which was race is the deepest thing that contributes to a person's identity, even more important than religion, amazingly enough. It's not your politics, it's not your religion, it's your race that gets you into trouble. So I think here, again, we might have an affinity between King and X in the sense that they saw the world as those who had and those who had not. The haves and have-nots. X is explicit near the end of his life saying, I don't think that the true Negro struggle, to use his locution, Negro, I don't think that the true Negro struggle is a racial struggle. He said that explicitly. It is not a racial struggle. He said it is a struggle of oppressors and oppressed. And wow. That's the language of revolution. That's the language of, that's the socialist language that was popular at the time. King, of course, the massive hesitation would be the violent nature of it. X has no problem with that. So X is much more open, as certainly the Black Power movement and Stokely Carmichael were, much more open to the Shays and the Fidels, the other revolutionary class-focused struggles of the mid to late 60s.
Wow. Well, great, very thoughtful answers for both of you. This is why I love it when you two especially are together, because like you said, you just... Yeah,
iron, baby.
Just keep adding to each other. It's fantastic. So we have about 4 minutes left, 3 minutes left, and I'm gonna kind of combine two questions at the end here. One is from Candy, who asks about what happened to Malcolm X's followers first after his break from Islam, but I would add, after his death. What happened to sort of his movement? Did somebody else take over? And Dan asked way back at the beginning about, he notes this, that he calls it the dynamic of African American disempowerment repeating itself, and wonders what has allowed it to continue since 64 and 65. So taking those two questions together, I guess my last question for you two is, what happens after King X? Where does it go from here? Who picks up the ball for sort of both ways of thinking about things? And where do we see the I don't want to say remnants, but where do we see sort of heirs since 1964, 65 to their way of thinking, even up to today? That's a huge question for 3 minutes, I know, but.
Pete, you get a minute and a half, and I get a minute and a half.
Boy, oh boy, yeah, that's difficult. Heirs of Malcolm X. I mean, if we look at the actual history, Justice Thomas presents himself as a certain kind of descendant of Malcolm X. So Malcolm's thought is multidimensional, and so it can point in different directions. I mean,
never would have thought of that.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the self-help ethic and the more restrained kind of nationalism, we can do things for ourselves, shows up in certain strands of Black conservatism that could be represented by Justice Thomas. The part that's friendly to the likes of Che Guevara, the democratic socialism, the radicalized opposition. There's a way of thinking of Malcolm's thought in which he bounces from one radicalism to another, that he bounces from nationalism to socialism. If you think that's the real Malcolm, then the likes of Angela Davis would be maybe the proper legatee of Malcolm. King, sort of same thing. Is it the people who are defending the idea of color blindness? You can make a case for that. Or is it the likes of Cornel West, the democratic socialists? You could make a case for that too. There are just different elements of this. Dan asked a question about that was the premise of which was Michelle Alexander's book that I got some stuff to say about, but I can't do it in a minute and a half. So Lucas, I'm gonna give you the floor, and maybe we'll have time later.
I was hoping to hear about that. All right. The only thing I'm going to say is we have to talk about Black Lives Matter. That is the most salient organization, although it's very decentralized, that is pushing for civil rights broadly understood in America. And for me, they are clear disciples of the Black Power movement. I did not teach the Black Power movement for most of my 25 years teaching race and equality, Black American politics, because I didn't see them at least salient as an influencer in terms of current cultural, social, political activism. But with the onset of Black Lives Matter, I mean, their attitude towards coalitions, their terminology in terms of allies, their terminology in terms of radical restructuring of society, that is right out of the Black Power playbook. Read chapter 2 of Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton's book on Black Power, published in 1967. The books on white fragility, the new Jim Crow, all of these books that deal with white privilege and white status, the institutional structural racism. Carmichael and Ture were decades ahead of these people. As I wrote recently in a companion piece to what Pete wrote as well in a companion piece, these academics right now are making their own fortunes, maybe not financially, but certainly in scholarly ways. They're making their fortune essentially cribbing from the Black Power book by Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael. So I think that's the clearest line of dissent that I see there. That's on the forefront and actually dictating the terms with which we discuss justice today.
Great points. Pete,
just real quickly, when BLM came on the scene a few years ago, there was the initial question raised about them was, okay, what do they want? What's their program? And so they came up with a program that was, read the list of BLM demands and compare it with the Black Panther Party's 10 points, and you find that they're very, very closely similar, and it's not accidental. That's where BLM took its influence. So Lucas is right about the Black Power thing. The Michelle Alexander stuff, I know that it's fashionable. I know those books are very widely read. The 13th is as a documentary is pretty much drawn straight from Michelle Alexander's book. They're widely influential. They're widely taught even at the pre-collegiate level. Just a couple, without being too polemical, I hope, a couple of words of caution about that. The critics, I think, have exposed really deep difficulties in the empirical analysis that pervades that book. That the argument hinges on the idea that mass incarceration is mainly a phenomenon in which huge numbers of nonviolent drug offenders are being imprisoned. That's really not empirically valid. That it hinges also on the argument that mass incarceration is doing great damage to Black family life. That's questionable. Just based on the premise that, it rests on the premise that the people incarcerated would otherwise be good family men. It's mostly men if they were out of prison. That's a dubious premise. It rests partly on the premise that the war on drugs is motivated by anti-Black sentiment. That again is dubious. And then BLM's whole narrative is based on an analysis of police shootings as racially biased, which has occasioned some pretty strong pushback in the literature about that. That's also empirically based. So take those claims with a degree of caution, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Pete. I know you've written on this as well, and I heard you speak on some of those topics when you were here
a little more cautiously than I just did, probably.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. But hey, we'll end on a little bit of a controversial note, but I like that because it gives our listeners other things to look into and think about if they so choose. So I think that's very useful. And I really appreciate both of you joining us. Very thoughtful as always. I would expect nothing less from you. So thanks very much for your time, and really do appreciate it.
It's always fun.
It always is, and the time goes fast. I wish we had another hour, but I know everybody's busy. So thanks for great questions from our participants today. Just a quick reminder about the email you'll receive with the link for your certificate of participation. Our next and final Saturday webinar of the season, of the academic year, will be The Great Society and Modern Conservatism on May 11th, and we'll be joined by David Davenport, who's a research fellow at the Hoover Institute, and Gordon Lloyd, who's emeritus professor at Pepperdine University. So hopefully you can join us again for our last Saturday webinar of the academic year. Again, gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us, and wish you both the best, and look forward to hopefully doing it again sometime.
And you too, Chris. What's the theme of these things for next year?
We're working on. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say or not, but Jeremy Gipton has come up with some ideas, and I think
I'll try to get it out. I'll throw
it out as a tease. American Lives. So playing off of a Plutarchian theme.
That would be really good.
So we're still working out the details, but that's kind of where we're leading, which might allow us to expand a little bit beyond sort of the sort of strictly political figures that we tend to look at. So maybe look at Ralph Ellison, for example, as American Life. So, all right, gentlemen, thanks very much. Take care. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, bye.